From the start, the climate scare was political. It came from the environmental movement, the sworn enemy of free market industrial capitalism.
Finally, we've got them. We can claim that it is the free markets who are destroying the planet, and we need big government to save us.
The climate problem, it is said, stems from the irresponsible actions of greedy, feckless individuals who have too many babies and drive too much and consume too many products, and of the capitalist corporations who pander to their whims. The solution is for government to have greater power to regulate private companies, but also to guide and reshape the lives and habits of individuals.
Policy agenda has sprawled into micromanaging everybody's lives on the most minute detail. What kind of stove you can use, what kind of heater you can have, how much you can set the thermostat out, where you can drive, what kind of car you can't. According to the planners, we're not going to have internal combustion engines an hour from now.
All of these things require the government to get involved, right? Because the government has to sort of force changes upon the public. If it was up to the public, we wouldn't be buying electric vehicles because, you know, they're impractical.
Support for the climate alarm is now virtually synonymous with disdain for free market capitalism and a yearning for bigger government.
It's liberals versus conservatives in the United States. And generally speaking, liberals are worried that we're destroying the planet. And they're also, of course, for big government. And then conservatives are at the other end of the spectrum, where a lot of them don't believe that we're destroying the planet, and they don't want government involved in their personal lives.
Paying lip service to the climate alarm has become almost universal among those who depend on government for their livelihoods. This includes those in the publicly funded education, arts and science establishments. Tony Heller recalls his time at Los Alamos Labs.
The entire county of Los Alamos was kept going by government money. That we had the highest incomes in the state. So naturally, people who lived in Los Alamos supported big government because that was where their livelihood came from. That was where their good schools came from. You know, everything good in Los Alamos came from the government. So of course, they were all believers in big government.
Among the largely publicly funded Western intelligentsia, support for more government spending and regulation is almost a defining moral badge. In these circles, to question the climate alarm is socially unacceptable. To be a climate skeptic is taboo.
Somebody that goes against it, it really does get met with a lot of anger and vitriol. And, you know, you're called a denier, a science denier, and a heretic.
Your colleagues won't engage with you anymore. You don't get invited to conferences. Your students may desert you. This is all really terrible.
Professors Henrik Svensmark and Nir Shaviv describe what happened when they published their results on the climatic effects of solar activity.
It was like all hell had broken loose because of this work. I had no idea that things would escalate as they did, and it completely changed my life.
Once we said that, people didn't like hearing it, and we became a persona non grata.
I mean, I have so many instances of people doing really nasty things. When I applied for a job, a group of scientists write to the university, say they shouldn't hire me. And that's a typical story, unfortunately.
If you don't agree with a standard polemic, you become an outcast, you're shunned, as if you have leprosy.
For Professor Sally Baliunas, the personal attacks became too much.
I retired early. And my family said I should have retired even sooner, years sooner. So they noticed the toll. It took a toll on them and me.
Dr. Matthew Wailicki was an assistant professor of geology at the University of Alabama when he decided to speak out about the climate scare. As a result of the backlash, he has decided to leave teaching.
to speak up about climate change in any sort of skeptical way was essentially career suicide, absolutely. There was no possible way that I would publish in quite a few of the mainstream journals that I was required to publish in. I essentially isolated myself from many of the funding institutions. This is one of the reasons you can build a consensus in a community, is because anybody who is skeptical of that consensus essentially gets kicked out of the community.
Speaking out in scientific ways that go contrary to the consensus, I would say is a career killer for people at the early stage of their careers.
If I were 30 years old in a university trying to make a career, I would certainly keep my mouth shut. And in fact, I went to some effort to keep my mouth shut when I was younger. I knew climate was nonsense then, but I was a little bit careful.
If a young person is questioning this, they can't put that in a proposal. The proposal will be denied, and they can't effectively publish because the gatekeeper will keep them out. And so it would end their career.
You have to go along with the global warming story. If you don't, you're going to get cut off, you're going to lose funding, you're going to get your career ruined, you're going to be trashed by the community, you'll be despised by your coworkers.
The so-called consensus on climate has itself become a weapon, a form of bullying, intimidation and censorship used against those who refuse to conform.
It's a tool that people use to bludgeon their opponents and the skeptics and to attack their character.
According to its critics, far from being scientific, the militant, intolerant climate consensus represents a devastating assault on free scientific inquiry.
I see my job as a scientist as just laying out the facts and letting people decide what they want to do. When you can't talk about the facts, things become corrupt.
If you shut the door on ideas, if you say you're not allowed to test it, you're not allowed to have that idea, you've left the realm of science.
I don't think climate researchers will ever back down from their claim that increasing CO2 is the control knob on today's climate system. I don't think they will ever back down from that, no matter what the evidence is.
It's clear it's now a cult that completely divorced from science.
But the apparently unstoppable climate scare does not just represent an attack on science. It is starting to shape for us a new kind of society. Environmentalists like to pose as anti-establishment, but their demands are well received and piously echoed by King Charles and the Archbishop of Canterbury, the BBC, the UN, the EU, by heads of government, the World Bank and World Economic Forum. In fact, by the entire state-funded ruling establishment.
Global warming is like the perfect problem that government can get involved in to grow the influence of government.
It's a wonderful way to increase government power. And if there's an existential threat out there that's worldwide, well, you need a powerful worldwide government, to cope with it.
If you're a climate activist, you're actually facilitating a huge validation of the government running our lives.
Many environmentalists, most environmentalists, all environmentalists who consider themselves to be radical, progressive alternatives are in fact simply reinforcing the mantras and the mainstream arguments of the entire establishment.
The demands on the government mean that the government suddenly gains the authority to interfere into every nook and cranny of our lives and how we live.
Everything has a climate narrative attached to it. How much you consume, where you spend your money, how much you travel, who you interact with, what types of food you eat, whether you eat meat. Everything has some sort of aspect that can be controlled with a climate lens.
Suppose 20 years ago somebody had hatched the idea that I would really like to ban cheap energy. I'd really like to control everybody's appliance purchases. I'd really like to tell everybody where they can go. And basically, I'd like to have dictatorial control over everything, well, it's not going to fly. No, everybody would think you're a nut and would ignore you. But fast forward 20 years, that's what's happening.
The publicly funded establishment in the West is so large and powerful. It is able to impose and enforce the official consensus on climate through its control of schools, universities, government, and much of the media. State broadcasters like the BBC exclude climate skeptics. Broadcasting regulatory bodies forbid private stations from disseminating skeptical views, threatening them with having their broadcasting licenses revoked.
What normally happens in an emergency is that all normal forms of openness and democracy have to be suppressed, because how else to deal with an emergency? So we are facing a situation not unlike lockdown, where basically all normal forms of behavior, normal forms of social communication, and normal forms of democracy are essentially ruled out. Activists are even calling for any skepticism to be criminalized.
In certain jobs and professions, it is now dangerous to express dissent on climate.
It's no surprise that people who are more skeptical will think twice before voicing their concerns, because they might risk their careers, they might risk their business, they might risk being sacked.
If you're a professional of any kind in science or law or medicine, if you belong to a professional association or you are in a university, you can be fired for saying what you believe.
The consequence is a censorious, authoritarian regime that has to control every move, every word, everything you want to do, because everything you do is a potential risk to the survival of mankind.
Climate protesters condemn capitalism, but at their anti-capitalist rallies, it's hard to spot anyone who looks like a worker, like a docker or crane driver or steel worker or a beautician or a trucker. The workers, it appears, are totally absent from these rallies, and for very good reason. Today's climate alarmists complain not that capitalism isn't producing enough, but that it's producing too much.
The modern capitalist system has led to prosperity. More and more people have more and more things. The modern anti-capitalism of the present time is a critique of capitalism that it gives us too much.
They think that the problem with capitalism now is actually that it's giving out too many rewards en masse to ordinary workers. And what they want instead, and this is often very explicit actually, is a much more austere, simple kind of lifestyle in which the mass consumption, the consumption choices of the great bulk of the population are controlled or even prohibited.
You have to consume less, you have to holiday less, you have to drive less, you have to eat less, and so on.
It seems that what upsets many environmentalists is not the failure, but rather the success of capitalism in producing an abundance of affordable goods for the masses.
Ordinary working people, for once, we've arrived at a point in history, in the Western world at least, where mass manufacture has allowed them cheap clothes, cheap food, cheap furniture. Therefore, you get a clash when affluent environmentalists express their disdain for mass consumption. People going on those big, huge cruise ships, it's like thousands of them. It's like, what are they doing? Oh my God, there's all those cruise ships, like ruining Venice, you know, ruining all our beautiful. We own them, don't we? They're not. What are they going there for?
What you have here is a classic example of class hypocrisy and self-interest masquerading as public-spirited concern. You could take these kind of green socialists much more seriously if they lived off-grid, they cut their own consumption down to the minimum, they never flew. Instead, you get constant talk about how human consumption is destroying the planet, but the people making all this talk show absolutely no signs of reducing their own.
What environmentalists call degrowth is being achieved by the trashing of our conventional energy and transport systems, and the forced introduction of expensive and unreliable alternatives. Already this is having the desired effect on industrial manufacturing, which is straining under the burden of punitive green taxes and regulation and higher energy prices.
The people behind the climate alarm couldn't give a damn about manufacturing. They have nothing to do with it. They don't know people who work in manufacturing whose jobs and lives depend on it. They're not excited by industry or industrial progress. They explicitly want to shut it down.
Kisii, Kenya, East Africa. According to many leading environmentalists, the world's poorest people should not aspire to the lifestyle of people in the first world. The planet will not cope. Grace Nyakananda is one of the many Africans who do not have electricity or gas to cook with or heat their homes. The resulting indoor smoke from burning wood and dry dung is the deadliest form of pollution in the world. For millions, the cause of lung disease, blindness, and early death. It's not just cheap, reliable electricity that Africa needs. Agricultural productivity here is incredibly low. Increasing it takes fossil fuels to make fertilizer and drive tractors and other farm machinery. Jasper Mashogu is a farmer.
Each and every African wants to develop, and improving agriculture is one of the easiest ways to do that. Agriculture is tightly tied to fossil fuels that the Western nations are saying we should not have access to.
Around a third of the food produced in Africa rots before it ever reaches the mouths of consumers. To prevent this terrible waste, Africa needs plastic packaging, refrigerated lorries, and good roads. All are opposed by Western environmentalists. All come with industrial development. All rely on affordable fossil fuel energy. Diarrhea from drinking dirty water still kills hundreds of thousands of African children. But clean water requires large industrial water purification plants and a modern water supply network. And this will come only with cheap energy.
I think it's pretty obvious that the West has got what it has because of fossil fuels. When people say Africa doesn't need fossil fuels, I wonder. I don't think they want what's best for us. They don't want us to develop, and that means we continue being starving, we continue being poor. Most people don't know what climate change is. They don't care. They want food on their table. They want to beat poverty. They want to beat hunger. They need money to better their lives. They want to flourish. That's just it.
When they use the word sustainable development, they're talking about no development. Exactly. I mean, the point is that, to develop sustainably means not to use too much energy, not to use too much carbon, net zero, the idea that you mustn't use too many resources, the fact you mustn't produce enough consumer goods because consumption is bad. So ultimately, the idea of development is out the window.
The Greens think the Africans should never use their resources the way the Europeans or the Americans or the Canadians or the Australians have used theirs. They are also in favor of punitive taxes, border taxes on any African country that wants to export their goods to Europe if they do use their resources. So that sums up the ethical ruthlessness and depravity of the green agenda.
But climate alarmists have a problem. Many countries in Africa and across Asia are simply ignoring the environmentalist demands of Western governments and international agencies. Communist China is estimated to be building an average of 2 new coal power plants a week. China now uses more coal than the rest of the world combined.
Which is one of the reasons why this whole climate agenda is falling apart, because the rest of the world is not cutting emissions, is not moving to renewables.
In the West, too, for many people, climate alarmism is wearing thin.
Ordinary people are not stupid, They have seen one ridiculous claim after another fail over and over. What this does is leave people with a profound and justified cynicism about what the scientific establishment says and about what the government says.
To fix the climate crisis, we're told, we must give up our cars. We must pay more for fuel, heating, clothes, food, fly less, limit where we go. This attack on mass travel, mass tourism, mass consumption holds little appeal to the masses.
People have started to realise it's going to cost them a lot of money to simply live the lives that they weren't leading, that they want to lead. And as soon as that started to happen, I could see people in the United Kingdom who had previously been indifferent to environmentalism suddenly think, how dare they do that, right? How dare they try and take away what we consider to be not luxuries, but necessities.
The whole policy of sustainability is about restraint. It's about restriction, it's about doing less. And that, obviously, for most people is anathema to their everyday needs.
The fact that there is actually an ideological movement of people who think that cheap mass production of whether it's houses or anything else is a problem. I mean, for God's sake, no wonder people become disdainful of the kind of middle-class outlook of environmentalism. But that is literally what people say. How can we stop people buying cheap things in shops?
When climate protesters climbed onto an underground train in London's East End, they were not cheered on by working commuters. They were held abuse, pelted, angrily dragged off the train, and received rough treatment on the platform.
If you were to go into a pub frequented mainly by what the Americans call blue-collar workers, you will find that being sceptical about climate change policy is not going to get you thrown out. Quite the contrary, somebody will probably buy you a drink. They can tell that behind all the talk about climate emergency, climate crisis, what there actually is an animus and a hostility towards them, their lifestyle, their beliefs, and a desire to change it by force if necessary.
Punitive and restrictive policies, carried out both in the name of climate change and COVID, have sparked protests in Britain, Canada, and other Western countries. Anti-establishment politicians and movements are gaining support.
What they underestimated was the fury that this would meet with ordinary people who just say, you can't do this, so you suddenly get this new movement.
Many working people are not merely sceptical, but positively angry about the climate alarm and all that flows from it. There is a suspicion, or perhaps realization, that climate change is an invented scare, driven by self-interest and snobbery, cynically promoted by a parasitic, publicly funded establishment hungry for ever more money and power. An assault on the freedom and prosperity of the rest of us.